Hey, I'm Devin Zeidelman. Today, we're in Frederick, Maryland at FITCI. We're about to have the next episode of BioBlast with Vic Suarez, CEO and founder of BlueZone Bio. So Vic, it's really good to see you today. We've seen each other a few times lately, but really delighted to be able to have a conversation with you today at Edge 321, which is home to FITCI, as you know.
Yes, I'm honored to be here with you, Devin, and be on the BioBlast podcast, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, it's great. So BlueZone Bio is a relatively new company. You spent 27 years in the Army. You were a colonel and retired honorably, so we appreciate that. And you have a lot of experience with advanced biomedical development and research, all the way through really robust supply chains, leading efforts like Project Warp Speed during the pandemic. And so tell us a little bit about BlueZone Bio, kind of your core mission and focus, and what you're looking to do and your engagement with clients.
Yeah, so BlueZone Bio is a relatively new company, like you said. We were founded in late 2023 here in Maryland, in Frederick, Maryland. And we're really excited and honored to be here at the Edge at 321 with the FITCI. Our big focus is we have two parts of the company. One part of the company, we really support life sciences companies grow and accelerate their performance in what they do, whether it's taking a product to commercialization or they're having a difficulty with a very technical challenge. We provide some services to really help them get to the next stage, and that's kind of in our advisory type roles in the company. There's the other side of the company where I have project teams and a lot of subject matter experts that we help work on specific projects that we're subcontracted to do to help those companies deliver those technologies or to, let's say, solve or bring forward a disruptive technology to the marketplace.
Yeah, and obviously the benefit of being here is obviously access to an ecosystem. We have wet labs to access as well, and so that's part of what we'll talk about. But before we really dive into current trends, what you're experiencing, there's a lot of obviously top-down pressure that we're seeing on life science and biotechs right now, not just domestically, but certainly globally. And so it's a really interesting time to have this conversation. But when you kind of look back at your career arc and overall experiences, can you just take the audience through your sort of trajectory of what your determinant was to get into biotech or biology or supply chain within the Army and the precursors to that, but then taking that all the way through sort of like what really made you passionate about this space now that you've began to build a business around it upon retirement?
Sure. So in the first, I'd say 9 years of my military service, which started in 1996, was really focused on operational health support in a combat zone with rapidly deployable units. For instance, the 82nd Airborne Division, 7th Special Forces Group, and then mechanized infantry units like the 1st Infantry Division deployed all over the world. And that was more about saving lives on the battlefield and preventing, preventable deaths.
Yeah.
And so what happened was I came back from Iraq in the end of 2004, came to Frederick, Maryland in 2005, and was fortunate to get a position at the United States Army Medical Material Agency, where they asked me to be the chief of fielding medical devices and sets, kits, and outfits that actually are all the devices and medical supplies that actually go into unit formations to actually deploy and then provide healthcare on the battlefield. And that proceeded with a 6-month internship where we traveled all over the industry, went to a bunch of training to learn about big Army, big industry logistics, but also how do you work with industry to take in the latest technologies, mostly trauma equipment and trauma-related supplies. Did that for several years and really liked the global mission. We had about 7 different fielding teams that we went into all parts of the world to modernize equipment while we were a country at war. And we got to see a lot of new technologies fielded, and really we got to see actually those devices being used to save actual American lives overseas. And it wasn't until 2006, I was part of an organization, the Silver Caduceus Society at Fort Detrick. I was on I was the vice president of this professional society, and we invited a keynote speaker in for our monthly engagement series, and it happened to be a giant in biotech here in Maryland, and his name was Dr. Wayne Hochmeyer, founder of MedImmune.
Yeah.
And I had since learned, as we were recruiting him, that he was a retired military officer who had done his last job at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Silver Spring as the chief of immunology. He had served previously in Vietnam. He had headed up our research labs in Nairobi, Kenya. And he was on the cutting edge in the 80s of monoclonal antibody technologies. And he was inspired by biotech that started in the 70s, Genentech and Amgen, and said, you know what, we can do the same thing here in Maryland. We can do the same thing in the Mid-Atlantic. And he decided to retire from the military at 20 years. He was an entrepreneur at heart. He had a steak dinner with an investor in New York City. That person handed him over a small amount of millions of dollars, and he was able to start a company. And that company ended up turning into MedImmune. And it wasn't until 2006 when he and I connected at this professional development lecture that we kind of hit it off, and he said, hey, if you want to learn more about what I do and what we do in biotech, biopharma, why don't you come over and have lunch with me at the office? And that started almost a 20-year relationship as a mentor-mentee, and it was really through his inspirational story and his role as not only a former military officer, but also how do you translate that leadership, that technology into commercialization for life-saving products was really what inspired me to eventually pursue other opportunities within the military to develop biodefense vaccines, and then eventually work and get detailed to HHS BARDA during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So it was really him that kind of helped me kind of think about that transition.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this, but you served 3 tours of duty, 2 in a combat zone, really supporting the warfighter, but ultimately warfighter as a patient on the far end of being the recipient of different technologies and innovations, both from the private sector, but also developed out of BARDA and different programs within the public sector. So in the pandemic, you were tasked and really responsible for leading Project Warp Speed, developing some opportunities and analysis around some of the national defense agreements, or rather, different regulatory elements of that time. So can you just speak to that a little bit, what you did during sort of the pandemic, what you learned during that? And then what's really interesting to me is how, given the macro today, good, bad, or indifferent, from how you evaluate that from the current administration and top down, but it's really some disruption now that's slightly different from the pandemic. So maybe you can talk about your work during Warp Speed, kind of what you saw, and then how that's juxtaposed into what companies are facing today in terms of supply chain and some of the global effects of some of the current US regulation.
Sure. So, I think the big takeaway from what I saw during the pandemic and my role at Warp Speed was, I was recruited there to be a program manager, a lead program manager of one of the vaccines that eventually got emergency use.
Moderna, I believe, right?
Yes. And so I was very fortunate to be paired up with a superstar team that was a hybrid of multiple interagencies. So I got paired up with an interdisciplinary scientist that was at BARDA. I had a lot of program management experience. I had experience accelerating the development of 2 other vaccines with other interagency and industry, the Ebola vaccine and the currently used Mpox vaccine. And so this was an opportunity for me to take that experience that I had with those 2 other projects and some other projects, and then really provide the leadership for about 20 people on that particular team. And so it was really an effort with a great team that was assembled. And I think the biggest takeaway that I could share with you is that we were in stealth mode for about 6 or 7 months, but it wasn't that we were developing in real time technology that didn't exist. Industry had already developed some of this technology that elements were invested in many years before. But what we were doing was we were actually mobilizing a bioindustrial base that needed to be mobilized in a great way. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that it was more about an industrial mobilization to really take on something as grand as a worldwide pandemic. And so it was a good utilization of people that know the science, that know how to commercialize something, but also know the bigger supply chain and manufacturing ramifications of mobilizing a bioindustrial base. But it also highlighted our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And as we talk about, reshoring products here in the United States, not being reliant on, let's say, adversarial nations for certain key materials, it really, right now, post-pandemic, that serves as a good backdrop or good reminder about we can never be in that kind of a vulnerable state again. And so it really serves as an inspiration as BlueZone Bio and a couple partners we have that are working with a lot of groups that trying to build that bioindustrial base here. And it's not about decoupling everything from China. It's about rebalancing our relationships across the whole span of the industry, right? There's going to be certain things that we have to define here in our country that are going to be essential. There are certain medications and there are certain treatments that are for a high number of vulnerable patients. And we need to prioritize on both the essential and the vulnerable medicines, things that we only have one source of supply on, whether it's from China or whether it's from a friendly nation or an allied partner. Having a single source of supply is a huge supply chain risk. So as long as the industry is willing to understand that, that's kind of where we're at now, right? And I think what you've seen in the last year or two, and then even now, right now with the new administration, is a real revelation that is like the new way forward, is a rebalancing.
So often companies have talked about, in terms of supply chain and risk mitigation, a China plus one strategy. Is it now China plus 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it not China, now go find another opportunity elsewhere? Because when you think about the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the way that those are compounded, the expedients and repellents that go into medications and therapies, where are you seeing some opportunities in terms of diversification for those companies that are thinking about that in their day-to-day strategy?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's China plus one. I think it's China plus all the above that makes sense. And so I think some countries that were identified, even in the previous administration and currently looking at right now, are some strong allies like Japan, South Korea, and some of the European Union nations that can make consistently high quality materials and do it in a way where they have access to independent judiciaries, where they have stable governments, that those private entities can actually thrive in those types of environments, where they can't have a government come in and then basically tell them what to do. They have the ability to protect intellectual property on behalf of their clients and the technologies that exist that oftentimes are invented in the United States. So I think there's so much opportunity there that we just need to rebalance and find out, okay, who are the best fit to make certain molecules or certain supplies? There's certainly going to be a number of organizations here domestically that have the capacity to make some of these, but the economics aren't really designed right now to reward that. So I think, policymakers, legislators, industry need to really identify opportunities that address the problems of why industry moved to China and India in the first place, right? And a lot of those are not really discussed, but a lot of those happen to do with economics. Environmental is a big part of it, but the economics. I mean, if you're going to charge, taxes for an organization a lot higher here in the United States to stand up a plant, and they can do that with a third of those taxes in a country like China or India, industry is going to gravitate to those locations. So I think it's really an overhaul of not only tax policy, other incentives, but also just looking at environmental regulatory policy and just other regulatory policies that make it hard for companies to do manufacturing in the United States.
Yeah, so you had testified to Congress March 2024, I believe, and really set up from that interview that I was able to see a lot of really interesting and key points that I think are important to hit on today. When you think about the overall capacity of the U.S. bioindustrial complex, can you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of companies' abilities to operate both efficiently and at scale when you're competing now with, again, kind of this race to the bottom in terms of pricing, costs? The whole healthcare system is really unique in America, I'll say, because there's payers, there's insurers, there's intermediaries. And so when you get back down to the basics of that bioindustrial complex, in terms of those capacities, what is your read?
Yeah, I think the first thing for your listeners to really recognize, and some of them do, that there's really two different markets here, right? So in the biopharmaceutical space, there's the branded, still on patent drugs. That's a completely different marketplace than the super majority of the generic medicines and some of the biosimilars that are the predominant number of the prescriptions, at least on the generic side. We're talking 90% of prescriptions that are prescribed in the United States are from the generic medicine side. And that market is a completely different business model, right? So on that model, lower access to capital to invest in new technology. So you're going to see those companies have less of ability to embrace advanced manufacturing technologies that maybe multi-billion-dollar companies on the branded side are able to invest in those types of technologies. And you're going to also see that the branded side of the industry is going to be less dependent on certain adversarial supply chains, let's say.
Sure.
And so they can really bifurcate their markets a lot better and to protect their bills and materials, and they can have multiple sources of supply. Whereas in the generic space, it's a lower margin to do that. And that's part of the economic kind of failure of how we've managed our pharmaceuticals in the United States is we are not really rewarding other aspects that are critical to medicines for the generic side. We've rewarded the lowest price without respecting independent, product quality. And when we don't evaluate the actual quality of the product, we then start to just gravitate towards cost as that variable. The other risk, I would say, is where the drug is coming from. Right? There's a location risk as well. And so we see that more on the branded side, where they're able to look at this more holistically and have a lot of secondary, tertiary suppliers. And then because they're protecting $1 billion blockbuster medicine. When you're making a few pennies a pill on a generic side, you don't have those incentives in place. So that's part of what's contributing to this problem. And I would just say, going forward, with my testimony, was really about how the military health system is actually being a vanguard in this area. And they're actually doing something about finding about where these medicines are coming from, their precursors, their key starting materials, their APIs, and what is the actual quality of those products.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you put it earlier today when we had a kind of initial conversation about sort of the legacy system in a sense, and how in order to innovate, we have to really rely on new, not only the technologies themselves, but a way of articulating and thinking about the strategy behind those frameworks. Are there opportunities, do you think, without a catalyst like a pandemic or trade wars or other geopolitical conflicts, that you think should be better ingrained in the way that U.S. policy is being developed around BARDA, ARPA-H opportunities? And then who's responsible in your mind for advancing the overall complex of what it's domestic supply chain, domestic compounding, development of therapies, of things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, so number one, I think in general, we need more disruptive thinkers. We need less people stuck in the milieu of bureaucracy and incumbency and the status quo. I see that a lot with biotech people.
Yeah.
And that's why I kind of gravitate towards people that work in that field, the small innovator that says, I'm really curious about how do we solve this legacy problem in a different way.
Right.
So I think it starts from people that think like that and that have long-term kind of fundamental principles of what are they trying to do. The other thing I really like about being around biotech, bioscience entrepreneurs is that they're trying to actually solve a problem, and they're not trying to just monetize making money off of a problem that they can just take advantage of for dozens and dozens of years. That's what excites me about some of the entrepreneurs I know that are going after curative medicines, right? Mm-hmm. How do we get around this process of just making money on medicines that people are relying on for 30, 40 years? Now, those medicines have a role. There are people that have chronic conditions that there's no amount of curative medicine that could be created that's going to reverse somebody that has a late stage of some type of chronic disease. So those medicines are still going to be needed. But we have an opportunity to have a new round of disruptive thinkers that says, you know what, we're not going to just accept the status quo. We're going to try to create curative medicines, but we also have to figure out the economics of it. How do we figure out so that we don't have these medicines cost $2 to 3 million people, $2 to 3 million, where access is a big problem and people can't actually even afford them. Insurance payers can't even afford it. So, I'm looking at technologies that can make that more affordable, more accessible, whether it's on-demand manufacturing of devices, where we can basically develop and produce medicines closer to where patients that need them need to actually access those medicines, where you don't need a $300 million CGMP plant, where you can probably get by with a $400,000 device in a $1 million suite that's located in an academic research center where they're doing oncology and rare disease research, where they're already treating patients. So those are the kind of things that I think will require kind of a new way of thinking of how we're going to shape the future. When it comes to thought leadership and who's going to run this, there's been always talk in the previous administration about having like a supply chain council or a czar that would lead this up. That never came to real fruition. That changed. So I think there's an opportunity now. There's a bill that's pending that came out of the National Security for Emerging Biotechnologies Commission. There's a bill that goes with that commission's readout that talks about creating a biotechnology kind of office leader team that's based at the highest levels of our government to kind of shepherd that new way forward. That could be an opportunity to do that. I think that's going to be probably more focused on the technology. I think nobody has yet figured out how we're going to solve the supply chain issue on the pharmaceutical side. I'm definitely eager to see how that can be done.
Yeah. And so when you think about building initially a supply chain, so let's say you're a small to medium size emerging biotech, you've raised some capital, you've got some active facilities, or you're at the point of a pilot scale where you might be relying more on contract services or manufacturing. I would imagine it's very difficult and costly and time sensitive to actually get one kind of direct chain, right, soup to nuts, put together and assembled. And so can you just kind of go into the inputs a little bit for companies that are trying to figure this out? Maybe it's a CSO and a number two business officer. Like, what would you advise them to be thinking about today as we're in a very sort of flexible, rapidly changing state of affairs?
So I would advise them that they've got to think in a manner that requires long-term life cycle planning, right? Because right now they're probably focused on the technology and the science. They're on a tight budget. They're just trying to make payroll. They're trying not to burn through the cash that their venture-backed fund is giving them. So I realize that's a tough place to be, and you're going to make these trade-offs and saying, hey, it costs me X to do this at a CDMO in the United States, or it costs me, 2 times less X if I do a CDMO overseas somewhere, let's say in China.
Or trials, right?
Right, or even trials. And so you can also make the argument that, the regulatory agency is a part of that, right? Our FDA has created over the years a focus on the process, and all the things to de-risk things are all well intended. But have we gone too far to the point where some of these medicines that are for rare diseases or life-threatening diseases, have we created such a process focus that we've now given an opportunity to other places that can streamline the costs on some of these things? And I think there's signs that some of those are being looked at right now to streamline review processes using artificial intelligence, looking hard at process-driven requirements and regulatory policy, and maybe focus more on, hey, what is the actual product doing, and then how is it actually performing in patients, right, post launch of the product, instead of just everything being done in the first 5-10 years of development, which now costs $1 billion to get to the marketplace. like, could we truncate that a little bit, streamline that, and then really tighten up a little bit more on the post-market surveillance of the product and the product quality and how it's actually affecting patients themselves. So I think there's some opportunity for some thought leadership and some policy rearranging there. I think when it comes to, going back to that chief science officer and that founder, I think getting in with somebody that can talk to them about life cycle planning, also share with them that investors are even looking at this even more. I've talked to a lot of venture capital investors in the past, let's say, year or so, especially when Biosecure Act came out, that are now looking at, okay, who are their suppliers? Is this small startup, are they completely reliant on a Chinese CDMO? Or are they diversified a little bit more with that? And I think they're making more and more risk assessments on that company's viability, and also the threat of the IP as well. Right. And I think that's another factor that the chief science officers and maybe the founders aren't aware of their technology being stolen, and they might be doing business with a country or the company that's in a country that doesn't have access to an independent judiciary. Sure. And that's the real risk. It's not so much that these companies are bad themselves. I would say the majority of these Chinese firms are good companies doing good science. They just happen to be in a country that don't give them an independent judiciary.
And so if you double click into emerging innovations, the notion of precision medicine, right? Very targeted CAR T type technologies that are very specific to the patient. And so far we've talked a lot about like small molecule compounding, different APIs, but when you add that into it, right? Now you're adding the source of a lot of this is the patient, and they're geographically specifically located. Access is an issue, certainly. But how do you think about then bolting on that individual at the start? So typically you think about it's the end. How do we get it to the end? Someone suffering from some sort of chronic disease or some sort of challenge, and there's a therapy for it. But now on the front end, you have to add that individual as well. And so does that change the calculus at all in terms of supply chain, risk mitigation, strategy?
100%, because now we're talking about individual genomic information, right? And we're talking about, the ability to protect that person's identity and their data at large. And I think that's just another layer of why I think when we're doing more, as the industry is more shifting towards personalized approaches, all the more reason why protection of the intellectual property, the genomic information is going to be really needs to be prioritized even more so. Because at the end of the day, once you have a breach in that at the personal level, you're going to lose confidence on the health system, and then mostly on the patients. Then you'll have patients in the future that are going to be hesitant to do a personalized approach because now they can't trust the company and the organization they've set up with their trading partners are going to protect their own genomic information. How do they know that information is not going to go back to somebody else that's going to use it for a malintent? Or all of a sudden they're going to get a letter that says they're no longer covered in their health insurance because somebody was able to see a risk in their genetic profile. I mean, these are the kind of things that can really, really mess up the whole movement of personalized medicines.
And this is slightly based on your experience within defense, right? Thinking about how do you get ahead and be proactive around the war fighter, right? In terms of maybe you're able to provide some early genomic evaluation of that individual to say, hey, if we get to a point of X, Y, or Z, we know 3 of these different therapies wouldn't work for an individual. And a lot of great technologies, as you know, back to the 70s, even with barter agreements coming out of NIH, which really has driven this kind of Maryland marketplace, which now includes Frederick. We'll talk about that too, just in terms of NCAPs. But coming back to the initial question, what are you seeing during your time in the defense complex in terms of that genomic sequencing precision medicine piece? Is it something that you think is ahead of industry?
I think one of the things that's a little different when we're talking like the military health system is that entire part of the industry, that subset, is really focused on readiness of that individual and their ability to do their mission. So we're not really in that industry, we weren't so much caught up on whether or not we can create a policy to say, okay, these are the services we're going to provide, and we're going to basically not provide these services, or we're going to delay reimbursements and all these other silly games that may occur in some parts of our healthcare system. It's truly focused on the full health readiness and optimization of that individuals for the long run, right? So they can do their mission, and that we can reduce disability on the back end.
Right.
When you have that as a kind of a framework, then it's easier to do things like you suggested, like, there's more than likely an initiative to do pharmacogenomic analysis of new recruits into the military, so that we can say, hey, we can put this information in their protected health record, so that we don't have doctors years later playing trial and error medicine, where we know that maybe certain therapeutics won't work well on this particular patient, but others will. And they don't have to fail on 2 or 3 different approaches before we can use the one that we already know now, because of their pharmacogenetic profile, is probably ideal for them. Right? Those are the kind of things that the military or organizations like HHS BARDA can actually lead on, right? Provide top cover for industry that's willing to go towards that, because it's really disruptive. It's not the norm, right? The incumbent health system isn't going to do that organically. So they need, and industry is going to struggle trying to get that through sometimes, because there's a lot of innovators that want to push that through, but they need kind of an ultimate place that's willing to do that. And oftentimes that's going to be a place like the Defense Department and places like HHS BARDA that are going to push the envelope on those ideas.
Yeah, so for companies that have kind of either an adjacent technology or platform in development, is it strategic for them to think about what is coming out of HHS and BARDA, where maybe it's not a one-to-one match in terms of technologies, but it's close enough where if you're successful in addressing some of these immediately identifiable opportunities within that complex, that then you can begin to slot in additional technologies.
Yep.
and build a company that way. Have you seen that be successful as a strategy for some of these companies you're consulting with?
Yes, and that is a very common approach for some of the clients that we support, right? Those that have recognized that they've got unique technology, that they have a certain number of, industry investment, venture-backed, but it's not enough, right? They need an organization, whether it's HHS BARDA, ARPA-H, or the Defense Department, to say, how can we actually augment that investment you've got and push it over the line for something that could be fielded and used in the population that those agencies are supporting, whether it's the military health system, whether it's the greater Americans at large for a stockpile medical countermeasure, or in ARPA-H's case, how can we do something that is the leap ahead in a legacy healthcare system,
right, to
improve the quality of human life, prolong, or induce resilience in people's health, prolong the onset of chronic disease. These organizations exist to do big things, take big swings at big problems. And I think as smaller companies realize that they may not get their first product that they're intending to get across the line, but they get one that uses their platform, this is a great opportunity for them to navigate this space, get that first product over the line for a needed purpose, and then use that opportunity to bring the rest of the pipeline in that they're thinking about.
Yeah, and so at the core of BlueZone Bio is being able to build a bench of services, supply chain operations, device manufacturing, and quality. But you also are getting in the lab. So can you talk about some of what you're doing in terms of core services, in terms of being able to help companies from kind of that traditional scientific wet lab environment?
So what I would say is really the core goal of why I founded BlueZone Bio was to help individuals. And this is why
with your wife, I believe, as well, right?
Yes, so she's one of the founders. But why we're a little different. So we spell ourselves Blue, B-L-U. That U is really important, right? It's not to be confused with Dan Buttner's version of a blue zone, which is tied to a geographic space,
right,
where people live, really healthy lives into their 90s and maybe to be 100 years old. It's to really empower individuals to optimize their own blue zones despite where they live, really to navigate through the risks of life. Poor quality food, environmental impacts, maybe some of the medicines you take, and then really also focus on self-efficacy and mastery of your own health so that you're not going to be dependent on a system. You can navigate that system with more knowledge and that you could actually avoid some of the risks that are out there, right? So it's about empowering you as an individual to achieve your optimal health. Now, what I would say is that some of the things that we do that's related to a lab is that we operate what we call a network of secondary labs that do secondary or confirmatory testing of some of the quality attributes of pharmaceuticals and are on the military health system formulary. Some of the most essential medicines that we have out there, it's about 42 essential medicines that have been flagged by the Defense Department are the most essential for the military health system. What we do, and that's about 2,000 national drug codes or what we call NDCs. What we do is we do secondary testing when a primary lab finds and flags one of those medicines as high risk due to, let's say, contaminant concentration, a carcinogen, maybe it's not the right purity and dosage, maybe it's not dissolving correctly in a simulated dissolution test. What we do is we take that high-risk medicine and then we confirm it again in one of about 5 different commercial or academic labs. And part of the reason why the military health system wanted to do that is they wanted to give some level of assurity to the client, in this case, patients, decision makers in the military health system, that when a primary lab finds this and flags this as high risk, that we can actually reproduce that same analytical data in a secondary lab. And then we even have another layer where an independent expert review panel looks at the data irrespective of the company or where the drug comes from, and then scores it under a rubric that was published in the Journal of the American Pharmacists Association, where a bunch of key opinion leaders that were like deans of pharmacy schools, physicians, and other scientists that actually came up with a rubric of how you could independently score the quality of a generic pharmaceutical against the brand name drug. And if it deviated too far away from the brand name drug, it's flagged as a high-risk drug, and we then test it again. And we look at using USP and FDA standards as well. So that's one of the projects that we work under, and we're excited to work on that, and we're hoping that that project continues to grow. And to just give you a glimpse of this kind of concept, this independent testing of quality of medicines has already been done for the last 3.5 years in one of the largest health systems in the country, and that's Kaiser Permanente. And Kaiser's flagged a couple dozen of these medicines that they require every batch to be actually tested independently in an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory in order to sell to the Kaiser Permanente. So the benefit for the 13 million members of Kaiser Permanente that are taking those number of drugs is that not only are these all FDA approved medicines, but every batch is independently tested for quality. And if there's a problem with that, Kaiser won't buy those medicines.
Yeah, we need definitely more of that. And being in Frederick, Maryland, historically not as prominent as some of the core cluster down in Rockville or Gaithersburg, but you have companies like Kite Pharma, AstraZeneca, Rooster Bio, Cartesian Therapeutics. Lonza, the list goes on and on and on. And so when you have an asset like Edge 321 and what FITCI's built here in terms of both kind of quasi-incubation, but really shared laboratory and office opportunities, can you unpack a little bit on why you determined this was a good fit for your company and where you see some of the benefit in this market?
Yeah, so I would tell you that Frederick, Maryland is a gold mine when it comes to entrepreneurs in the bioscience, biotech, life sciences space. It's got such a vibe here in this town with those companies that you mentioned, but also if you think about it, we're only 5-10 minutes away from Fort Detrick and the National Cancer Institute, Frederick, right? There are GMP plants all over this town. It's got a community that people want to be able to come here. There's affordable housing, at least compared to down the road if you try to price out real estate. Just 30 minutes south of here versus here. You've got the Catoctin Mountains right in our backyard, so you actually get some land and terrain. You have amazing farmland here, and you have a thriving downtown with a lot of cultural events every day, every week. And so when people come here, it's more about when you're looking for real estate for, let's say, your life sciences company or your manufacturing company, you got to look at the total like location itself.
Right.
Access to good schools. Is it relatively safe? Does it have a good cultural art scene? Does it have different variety of housing to support my families? Are employees going to be engaged, to be motivated at work? And what you have here at the FITCI Edge is you have 20 plus companies just in this building alone, and a couple dozen more in the other facility, that are in such a supportive environment, and they're surrounded and inspired by some of these other big companies like you mentioned,
right,
that have graduated. Some of them, like Rooster, I believe, like spun out of the FITCI.
Yeah.
And They're Adaptive spun out of the FITCI. And so, those bigger companies have started at places like this incubator, and really there's so much lessons that are learned about that, and there's so much assistance that I think more and more companies should consider coming here. We also have access within an hour to 3 international airports.
Yeah.
So access to the world is all here. And so we have a bunch of soft landing partners that have specifically said, hey, we want to come to Frederick, Maryland because you're equidistant to 3 international airports, right? So that's another like geographic and logistical like advantage that most places don't have.
Yeah, I mean, we advise clients often, obviously, on real estate strategy within the life science marketplace. And, Frederick is arguably one of those, hey, from a talent perspective, you can still pull PhDs from Montgomery County, but you can also pull more of that blue collar talent from a GMP perspective or biomanufacturing perspective, from as north as Pennsylvania.
Yes, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, northern part of, Washington County, Frederick County, Howard County. You have the combination of both. And I think you hit it on the head. We have such a diverse workforce, educated PhDs, scientists at terminal degree level, all the way to kind of entry level lab employees that can get certified, to people that can work on a manufacturing floor. You have it all here. And I think that's another advantage.
Yeah, very, very friendly business environment. We could go on and on and on. But, part of this is educating, but also would love to give you the last word, anything that's on your mind or that you think people really should be thinking about, particularly as founders and entrepreneurs of life science, biotech, and pharma companies.
Yeah, I would just say, for all, I've only been in this for a year and a half.
Right.
But I would say that for all the other fellow innovators and founders, people that are working in the life sciences, I think that this is a great time to be in this space, especially if you've really thought, what is your purpose? Right. If you're in the realm to improve the quality of human life, extend the quality of life, if you're there to protect life, if you are in it for the right reasons, then you're, coming into this space is a good move. If you're in it just to make a buck and you really haven't thought deeply about what you're trying to do, you're gonna run into some pitfalls, I think, in the long run. And I think once you've figured out what your purpose is, then I think it'll rub off and other people will want to invest in your company. And if you can articulate that, it's even better.
Yeah. Well, Colonel, Vic Suarez of BlueZone Bio, we're here at FITCI on BioBlast. Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Devin, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.